History is built on moments of hesitation, single instance when leaders blank and the world takes a different path. In 1945, after 6 years of global carnage, humanity stood at another crossroads. The guns had fallen silent over Europe.
The swastikas were torn down.
The flags of victory flew over Berlin. But behind the applause and speeches of peace, a new storm was gathering. Because as the Allies celebrated the end of one war, Winston Churchill was already planning the next. His plan had a fitting name: Operation Unthinkable, a blueprint for a war that could have changed everything. But what if it had actually happened? Following Germany's surrender, the uneasy alliance between the West and the Soviet Union began to crack almost overnight. The victory that had united them now became the very thing that divided them. In the power vacuum left behind by the fallen Reich, the Red Army surged westward like a tide of iron, swallowing whole nations along its path. Within months, Eastern Europe was gone, absorbed into Stalin's sphere. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a metaphor anymore. It was a border made of barbed wire, ideology, and fear. The turning point in this alternate timeline began much earlier, in 1943, when the Polish Prime Minister Władysław Sikorski died in a mysterious plane crash over Gibraltar. The official report called it an accident, but few believed it. This was not the first accident to shadow him. Twice before, he had narrowly escaped death in suspicious circumstances. One plane had been rigged with explosives, another tampered with before takeoff. Conspiracy or coincidence, it didn't matter anymore. His death changed the course of Poland's fate. In his place rose Kazimierz Sosnkowski, commander of the Polish army, and a man forged in the crucible of his nation's struggle for survival. Sosnkowski was no stranger to war or politics. He had been the trusted right hand of Józef Piłsudski, the father of modern Poland. The British admired his discipline, and his soldiers worshipped him. When he took the reins of leadership, his first act was to defy history itself. Unlike in our timeline, Sosnkowski refused to support the Warsaw Uprising. He foresaw the tragedy, the mountains of civilian corpses, the ruins of a burning capital, and the betrayal that would follow. Against immense pressure, he halted the operation. His decision spared nearly 250,000 lives and preserved the backbone of the Polish resistance, the Armia Krajowa. That single decision changed everything. With the underground still intact and operating in secret, British intelligence gained a powerful web of eyes and ears across occupied Poland. Their agents could now coordinate directly with local fighters, gathering intel on Soviet troop movements, logistics, and morale. The Western Allies, who once doubted whether Poland could stand on its own, began to see a new possibility. Perhaps Operation Unthinkable was not madness after all. Perhaps it was possible. Across the Atlantic, however, another power was stirring. The Manhattan Project had just crossed the threshold from theory to weapon. The atomic age had begun. Stalin's spies knew much of the project's progress, but even he couldn't predict how quickly the balance of power would shift. He assumed Roosevelt would continue to depend on Soviet manpower to defeat Japan. But fate intervened. Roosevelt was dead, and Harry S. Truman now sat in the Oval Office. Truman was no idealist. Under the hard counsel of Navy Secretary James Forrestal, he began to view Stalin not as an ally, but as the next threat. "Deal with them now," Forrestal warned, "before they have the means to dictate the peace." And then came General George S. Patton, the man who had crushed the Nazis in Europe, the restless warrior who couldn't stand peace. "We promised Europe freedom," he said, his voice echoing in the halls of command. It would be worse than dishonorable not to make sure they have it. The Russians? They're not ready. They've got no fuel, no air force worth speaking of. Their supply lines are a joke, wagons pulled by starving horses. Give me the Third Army, and I'll push them back to the Urals in 6 weeks. He paused, his gaze cold and prophetic. But mark my words, one day we'll have to fight them anyway. The longer we wait, the higher the price will be. Weeks of tense meetings followed between Truman, Churchill, Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Patton. The British were desperate for commitment, the Americans cautious but convinced. Finally, a decision was reached, not in public, but behind locked doors. Operation Unthinkable was to be executed. Its new form was ambitious beyond belief, a lightning strike deep into Eastern Europe, spearheaded by Anglo-American and Polish forces. The code name was changed to Operation Vasa, a nod to the Polish king Sigismund III Vasa, who had once invaded Russia and nearly captured Moscow itself. The symbolism was clear. History was about to repeat itself. Any hope of negotiating with Stalin vanished. Yet disagreements simmered over the role of France. The British considered it unreliable. France's Communist Party, loyal to Moscow, was massive and militant. A declaration of war could plunge the country into civil chaos. Nor did London or Washington place much faith in Charles de Gaulle. To them, France was broken, divided, and exhausted. Ironically, they saw more promise in a rearmed Germany than in their old ally. But the Americans, now facing the vast scale of the Red Army, began to reconsider. They realized that this war, if it came, would not be won by a few divisions. It would demand the whole of Europe. France, war-torn or not, had to fight again. And fight they would, whether they wanted to or not. As the Western powers plotted, Moscow was already suspicious. German divisions that should have been disbanded were quietly kept intact. Their tanks and artillery were being maintained under British supervision. Soviet spies in occupied Germany and among the Polish partisans reported strange movements, the storing of ammunition, the sudden halt of troop redeployments to the Pacific. Stalin's agents whispered of a second front, not against Japan, but against them. This time, the Soviets would not be caught off guard like in 1941. They were watching. As tension thickened, the generals in London and Washington felt the clock ticking. To them, the choice was clear. Finish the job now, or face a red Europe later. But the soldiers and civilians who had just survived 6 years of hell saw things differently. They were tired. They were broke. They wanted peace, any peace. For half a decade, Allied propaganda had praised the Soviets as brothers in arms, heroes who crushed the Nazi war machine. To turn around and call them the new enemy overnight was a propaganda nightmare. And yet, the truth has a way of bleeding through. The Polish government in exile struck first. They released a chilling document, the Red Book. It detailed, in harrowing precision, the Soviet massacres in Katyn, Volhynia, and eastern Galicia, the ethnic cleansings, the deportations, the executions. Photos of the dead, letters from prisoners, witnesses' testimonies. For the first time, the West saw Stalin's regime for what it truly was, not a liberator, but a conqueror. Public opinion across Britain and America shifted almost overnight. Newspapers printed the atrocities. Church pulpits denounced the new tyranny rising in the East. The same people who had once cheered for Stalin now saw him as the mirror image of Hitler. Still, time was running out. The Allied public might have been awakening, but the governments could not wait for permission. The Soviet buildup continued daily. Churchill and Truman knew that hesitation would mean surrendering half the world to dictatorship. And so, in the quiet corridors of Whitehall and the Pentagon, maps were drawn, lines traced, divisions reassigned. The next Great War, the war that should never have been, was being prepared. If the West was to fight again, they would have to fight like the enemy they once defeated, with precision, deception, and overwhelming force. The world had escaped one apocalypse, only to stand on the edge of another. Under the cover of darkness, Allied intelligence staged a false flag attack supposedly carried out by Soviet forces against Western positions in Germany. The incident shocked the public. Explosions near Dresden, intercepted radio chatter, fabricated reports of Soviet aggression. Within hours, Churchill and Truman stood before the cameras, solemn and resolute. The Soviet Union, they declared, has violated the peace of Europe. World War III had begun. The first strikes came swiftly. In the opening days, Allied forces surged through Soviet-held territory in Poland and East Prussia. Their objective, the MG Line, stretching from Minsk to Gdansk. Backed by air superiority and coordinated sabotage from the Polish underground, the offensive caught the Red Army off balance. Bridges collapsed, railways vanished in flames, and communication lines went silent. The Soviets fell back, confused and bleeding. Meanwhile, chaos erupted behind enemy lines. The Polish Home Army, still intact thanks to Sostkowski's earlier defiance, rose in full revolt. Cities once under Soviet control exploded in open rebellion. Vilnius, Lublin, Krakow, each one turning into a nightmare for Soviet garrisons. The underground sabotage crippled supply lines so severely that entire divisions were stranded without fuel or ammunition. Czechoslovakia, still bitter and traumatized by Munich, threw its lot in with Moscow. Czech divisions mobilized under Soviet command, defending the Carpathian passes against the advancing Allies. But the rest of Europe began to shift in the opposite direction. Germany, newly rehabilitated and rebranded as the West's reluctant ally, was welcomed back into civilization. The memory of Hitler was buried beneath layers of propaganda, replaced with the image of a new Germany fighting for freedom against barbaric Bolshevism. German engineers repaired tanks. German divisions marched once again, this time with British and American flags overhead. The Western press hailed them as defenders of Europe, and the German people, eager to erase their shame, answered the call. For many, it felt like unfinished business, Barbarossa reborn, only this time with redemption instead of conquest. Of course, not everyone was pleased. The Poles protested fiercely at first, unwilling to fight beside those who had destroyed Warsaw. But politics has no room for purity. When London promised Poland new borders, territorial compensation in Silesia, Pomerania, and East Prussia, opposition softened. Necessity made allies of enemies. The man chosen to lead this new German military was Rudolf Christoph von Gerstoff, a respected officer of the Abwehr, the former German intelligence service. He had fought on the Eastern Front and had exposed the Katyn massacre, making him a convenient symbol of German honor in contrast to Soviet cruelty. More importantly, he had been involved in Operation Valkyrie, the failed plot to kill Hitler. This gave him moral legitimacy, the face of a different Germany. The Allied press elevated him overnight,
transforming him into a hero of the Free German Forces.
Behind the scenes, the Western governments began reshaping public memory.
The Holocaust, now beginning to surface in the liberated camps, was swiftly pinned exclusively on the SS and the Nazi Party, as if the rest of Germany had been captive to their evil.
It was the birth of the clean Wehrmacht myth, a narrative carefully constructed to make the new ally palatable. The world needed the Germans again, and truth, as always, was the first casualty. For Churchill, the gamble paid off, at least at first. The British public, shocked by the Soviet attack and convinced of Stalin's betrayal, rallied behind him.
The war hero returned triumphantly to office.
To them, this was not a new war, but the final act of the last one. The Empire's aging lion had one more fight left in him. And for a time, it seemed victory was inevitable. The West held every advantage the Germans had lacked in 1941. Abundant fuel, global industry, overwhelming naval control, and skies ruled by thousands of bombers.
Stalin's armies, though vast, were exhausted.
The Soviet Union had already lost over 40 million lives. Its economy was in ruins, its farmland scorched, and millions of men were still buried in Europe's soil. When the Western embargoes cut off vital imports, food, steel, oil, the Soviet war machine began to starve. By 1946, the Red Army was forced into defensive warfare. The famine that would historically kill 2 million civilians now raged unchecked, worsened by Allied blockades. Starvation stalked the villages of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Meanwhile, Western technology advanced at lightning speed.
Atomic weapons were no longer a secret. They were mass-produced, refined, and diversified.
The Allied High Command quickly realized they couldn't simply drop 2 bombs and expect surrender. Japan had crumbled under 2 detonations, but Russia was a continent. So they adapted. The new plan was tactical nuclear warfare, precision strikes on Soviet logistics, rail hubs, and industrial centers. Within months, mushroom clouds scarred the landscapes of Minsk, Smolensk, and Kursk. The devastation was unlike anything the world had seen. Millions fled eastward as entire cities were reduced to ashes. The Soviet military began to fracture under the combined pressure of famine, rebellion, and radioactive ruin. Further east, China burned as well. The Chinese Civil War, already raging between nationalists and communists, became another front of this global inferno. Western-supplied nukes struck key Soviet-backed positions in Manchuria, devastating Red support in the region. The dominoes began to fall. Stalin's scientists raced desperately to complete their own atomic weapon, but they were years away. The Soviets could not retaliate. For the first time since Napoleon, the Russian Colossus was defenseless. But the West's greatest weapon was not nuclear fire. It was ideology. Unlike Hitler's invasion, which came cloaked in racial hatred and conquest, this new crusade carried a message of liberation. Western propaganda flooded the airwaves. Not conquerors, liberators. Not masters, allies. Leaflets dropped across Soviet lines promised freedom, bread, and a new Russia free from tyranny. And it worked. From the ruins emerged a new Russian faction, the ROA, or Russian Liberation Army, reborn from the ashes of its earlier failures. This time, it wasn't a German puppet. It was sponsored by Washington and London, commanded by Sergei Vlasov, a former general of the White Movement who had fought in the Russian Civil War and later with Czechoslovakia's forces. He despised both Stalin and Hitler, a man without illusions but with one clear goal:
the death of the Soviet Union. Under his leadership, hundreds of thousands of disillusioned Red soldiers began defecting. Cities rose in rebellion. The old ghosts of the Russian Civil War returned to life. Monarchists, Republicans, Cossacks, Orthodox clergy, all united by one desire: to burn the system that had enslaved them. This, finally, was the crack the West had been waiting for. The Soviet Union, already on its knees, began to tear itself apart from within. No one knows exactly how long this war would have lasted. Some historians argue it would have dragged on until 1950. Others say it might have ended sooner, with Stalin overthrown by his own generals. But one thing is certain: Europe would have been unrecognizable. Entire cities erased. Nations divided by radioactive wastelands. Tens of millions more dead. Even in victory, the Allies would inherit only ruin. A shattered continent, a poisoned sky, and the haunting realization that, in trying to prevent one tyranny, they might have unleashed another. Because in this world, this unthinkable world, there was no peace. Only ashes, and the memory of what could have been. The Allied nuclear campaigns had rewritten geography itself. Vast stretches of Eastern Europe were uninhabitable, from the blackened plains of Belarus to the poisoned forests of Western Russia. Even decades later, the soil would still glow faintly at night. Predicting where one country ended and another began was no longer possible. The new order would not be born from diplomacy, but from fallout. And yet, amid the ruins, new nations were rising, some born of idealism, others of sheer survival.
Just as the collapse of Austria-Hungary after the First World War had redrawn the map, so too did the collapse of the Soviet Union scatter pieces of empire across the continent.
Puppet states, provisional governments, and hastily assembled republics appeared overnight, many destined to vanish just as quickly. At the heart of it all stood three uneasy victors: Germany, Poland, and the Russian Liberation Army. They had fought together to destroy the Red Empire, yet their shared victory masked 1,000 ancient hatreds. A millennium of blood lay between Berlin, Warsaw, and Moscow, and no treaty could erase that. Poland had received the greatest share of Allied favor. After all, Operation Unthinkable had been conceived to free the Poles. But freedom came tangled in ambition. In 1943, the Polish government in exile had published a memorandum outlining its post-war dreams: the annexation of East Prussia, Danzig, and a straightened western frontier to guarantee security. In this alternate timeline, those ambitions became terrifyingly real. Germany, defeated yet indispensable, was forced to surrender large territories to its former enemy. It was still a better fate than the Soviet Oder-Neisse line of our history, but humiliation nevertheless. Western promises of compensation, perhaps in Austria or the Sudetenland, remained vague. The Austrian socialist regime, once liberated, was declared illegitimate by the Allies, and a new annexation movement stirred in Vienna. Old ghosts whispered of Anschluss reborn, this time under Allied blessing. Meanwhile, Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. The Czechs, who had sided with the Soviets, were punished. The country was torn in two, a Slovak republic in the east and a partitioned Bohemia in the west, half Czech and half German. It was a geopolitical patchwork built on resentment. Across the Balkans, chaos reigned. Yugoslavia was annihilated, its land shredded between Italian forces, Croatian fascists, and Serbian royalists. Ethnic cleansings followed one another in endless succession.
The map of the Balkans became a blur of borders drawn in blood. Hungary, after switching sides and aiding the Allies, managed to regain some territory lost after Trianon, though not all. Romania, under King Michael I, restored most of its pre-war lands, reclaiming Bessarabia from Russia. The carved-up Balkans and Carpathians were stitched together with desperation and mistrust. Eastern Europe presented an even deeper nightmare. Historians call it the Ukrainian conundrum. Poland had been one of the three main Allied armies alongside Britain and America, but as the ROA grew, Russian defectors soon outnumbered Polish troops. The question became inescapable. What would become of Ukraine? Belarus, considered less strategically vital, was quietly handed to Poland as a client state. But Ukraine, the breadbasket of Eurasia, was another matter entirely. For Russians, losing it meant losing their soul. For Poles, it was both a buffer and a curse. Memories of the Volhynian massacres ran deep. Many Poles wanted vengeance, even erasure. Prime Minister Sosnowski, however, understood the danger. A Polish empire built on corpses could not survive. Instead, he pushed for a compromise, a smaller, weakened Ukraine ruled as a Polish protectorate. Not independent, but not destroyed. A fragile peace built on necessity. That compromise evolved into something greater, the rebirth of the Central European Confederation, the long-forgotten dream of a Polish-led alliance stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Sikorsky had once whispered the idea to Churchill. Now, under Sosnowski, it finally became reality. Within this new Commonwealth, Poland sat at the center, joined by Bohemia, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Vilnius became the symbol of unity, the eagle and the bow entwined once more. On paper, it promised collective security, a shield against future empires. In practice, it was an alliance of exhausted nations clinging to survival. Far to the north, Russia's collapse released other captive nations. Finland pushed to the Karelian Isthmus. Armenia and Georgia broke free in the Caucasus, ending centuries of imperial shadow. The red flag was gone, replaced by 100 smaller banners, monarchist, republican, anarchist, nationalist, fluttering in the ruins of empire. And with the Soviet Union erased, the ripple spread far beyond Europe. Two possible futures stood before humanity. In the first, communism was dead. With no Moscow to fund revolutions, no Comintern to arm insurgents, Marxism itself faded into myth. The workers' movements of Asia and Africa were orphaned, their leaders silenced or forgotten. In the second, decolonization died with it. America, which had once championed independence for the colonies, now had a different mission: to rebuild Europe and maintain its unity. To do so, it needed Europe strong, and that meant Europe had to keep its colonies. Oil from Indonesia, rubber from Malaya, tin from the Congo, these became the fuel of Reconstruction. The Dutch, French, and British found the United States suddenly supporting their imperial claims once again. The language of freedom was quietly replaced by the language of stability. Colonial revolts that might have been funded by the Soviets simply never materialized. African and Asian resistance movements died in silence, their leaders cut off and forgotten. It was an ugly peace, a peace built on exploitation and amnesia. In China, Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the undisputed master of Asia. Without Soviet aid, Mao's forces collapsed. By 1948, the nationalists controlled all of China,
Manchuria, and Korea, a unified empire under the banner of anti-communism.
The divide between North and South Korea never happened. Instead, the Korean peninsula became a loyal ally of Washington. The Pacific was now a Western lake.
By 1950, the war that had begun as Operation Unthinkable finally ended.
But what followed was no celebration. Europe was a graveyard. Its fields glowed with radiation, its rivers ran with ashes, and its cities were nothing but shells filled with the echoes of the dead.
Yes, the world was free of communism, but in its place stood something colder and quieter.
The Allies had won, yet they had become what they feared, the guardians of an empire built on myths.
The German crimes of the Second World War were buried under propaganda.
The Holocaust was reduced to a footnote in the narrative of liberation. The clean Wehrmacht myth flourished, and those who had once served tyranny were now celebrated as heroes of the new order.
Justice was a luxury no one could afford anymore.
Africa and Asia remained under the European yoke.
The Middle East became a chessboard for Western armies.
The Cold War never arrived because the world was already frozen in its grip. So what would this world look like? A world without the Soviets, without communism, without decolonization?
Perhaps the Allies would stand united forever.
Perhaps they'd turn on each other next.
But one thing is certain. The price of total victory is always the same. Truth dies first, and humanity follows.
Because in the end, Operation Unthinkable wasn't just a plan. It was a warning of what happens when the world survives its wars but loses its soul.